From unions to astroturfing groups, lobby groups have an undue influence on the way that we see politics and politicians. That's what we're going to be exploring in this week's episode of The Public Gallery. Here in Aotearoa, lobby groups are legal, but there's not just one sort of blanket definition for what a lobby group actually is, and what they can do, what they've achieved, how they affect policies and politics and public discourse. It's quite an influential area that most Kiwis just don't understand or don't realise is there until it makes the news. As a lobby group, we saw earlier in the year lobbyists were actually using swipe cards that they were given to get into Parliament, and that seems a little bit dodgy that a lobby group would have that sort of access to our elected officials. And it's an area that a lot of New Zealanders just don't understand. So much so that Sarah was supposed to join us in this week's episode, and she decided to opt out because she's just not comfortable with her knowledge base around the topic itself. We've got lobby groups that have been around for over 100 years, like Federated Farmers, who make a lot of noise but only represent about the population of Te Awamutu or Kaiapoi, about 13,000 people. And you've got other lobby groups that have been set up as part of an outreach program by political parties specifically, like the Taxpayers Union or Groundswell, who have links back to particular parties and wanting to push their policies and making it look like it's a grassroots movement. So this week, I wanted to explore what our panel members knew or know about lobby groups. Are there any that jump out? Are there some that they don't consider lobby groups because they've kind of become ingrained with who we are? And what impact do they see lobby groups as having on our politics, on the policies that affect us, and on the election season that we've got coming up this year? In Kirikiriroa, Hamilton last weekend, the Agricultural Field Days was on at Mystery Creek, and it's a huge event for the region. It brings in hundreds of millions of dollars. There's a huge swell in the population. It kind of gives us an indicator as to how the rural sector feels things are going based on how much money that they spend, and it is the perfect opportunity for lobby groups and MPs, politicians, political groups to get out there and speak directly to the farming community in this country. So, of course, most major political parties were there, as well as some of the lobby groups. One of those lobby groups is Groundswell, which is what we call an astroturfing group. It's a fake lobby group set up to try and mimic a grassroots movement around farmers and what they want. This particular astroturfing group was initially set up with the help of the Taxpayers Union, which is another astroturfing group that's designed to push the narrative for the ACT Party. The Groundswell people had themselves a bit of an interesting time at the field days. They decided that they were going to sell golf balls with the faces of a number of Labour MPs and Green MPs on them, and they weren't allowed to do that. It's in the terms and conditions for people who have stalls that they basically have to be respectful of everybody else that's around there, and having a product like that which is designed to target specific individuals that were also there was really not something that they were allowed to do. The field days organisers received a dozen complaints about this particular product and asked them to remove it, and have actually said that if they had spotted it before the complaints, they would still have asked them to remove it because of those terms and conditions. But Groundswell still put out the narrative that Labour had forced them into removing those items because they were trying to crack down on free speech. That narrative was then picked up by other disinformation spreaders within that particular sphere. Brian Tamaki himself turned around and says, well, good to see that they've sold out. And former Democracy New Zealand candidate Lee Smith from Te Awamutu, she decided to get herself a set of these golf balls and started promoting them, as well as trying to put in that narrative about free speech being crushed by the Labour Party. That's a really powerful move for a lobby group basically spreading disinformation to try and put across their perspective. And it got me wondering, how much do we actually know about lobby groups? What are their influences that we're not even aware of? And are there other influences out there from lobby groups and lobbyists that we need to take into consideration as voters? When I sat down with our panelists this week, I asked them a series of questions around lobby groups, lobbyists, and what they do. And it was really quite fascinating because they're two very different individuals who have two very different perspectives on the topic. For Kelli, she'd not really considered lobby groups in general as part of the tapestry that makes up how our politics works, which is really interesting to see considering she's worked in a field that has people who do this kind of thing.
Yeah, this one's an interesting one. I don't think I know anything about lobby groups. I don't know what defines a lobby group. I don't know. I know that it's a dirty word. I know who I associate to be lobby groups, and that's Federated Farmers, Groundswell, uh, the alcohol industry, the gun lobby industry. I had never considered that forest and bird or unions were lobby groups as well. And I'm wondering if maybe that's because I see them as doing good, but I guess doing good depends on your opinion.
For Dan, though, he's actually part of a lobby group, technically. As a registered master electrician, that organisation is designed to lobby the government and to work with government and to reach out to the public to build trust in what electricians do. The work that the lobby department does with the government is around things like safety standards or training rules, putting that into place and making sure that people are kept safe. And if those standards weren't there, the effects could be deadly, like really deadly. If you ended up with somebody who was kind of dodgy with what they're doing and without having that public outreach, knowing that you can trust a registered master electrician.
I think there's definitely some need for lobby groups, um, because it's a common voice. Get the like-minded people, not so much the likes of say, well, I suppose Groundswell is common-minded people that get the weirdos together too. And I think it's really good having unions and those sorts of things. A lot of their approach to Parliament, I think, is not the right approach.
So the work of the lobby group that he deals with is really specific to his industry. I also asked both of our panelists this week about campaigns that they knew of that had been successful. And it was a really interesting one because, in terms of a one on one campaign, a lobbyist going in and making a change, Kelly had a really super specific and somewhat dodgy sounding example that she was able to give us.
Example of a lobbyist having influence in terms of where I work and my bubble. And I don't know all of the details, was the alcohol beverage lobbyist who ended up in Chris Hipkins' office. And then the container return scheme was then binned or canned. And he had been lobbying against the container return scheme for years in the beverage industry. So that was my most probably recent awareness that lobbyists can get in there and can chuck out really good policies that have a lot of community support just at the what seemed at a whim. It seemed to just come out of the blue.
What Kelly's talking about here actually highlights a far bigger issue because the story is far bigger. The individual that she's talking about, the lobbyist, that's Andrew Curtin, who is now the Prime Minister's Chief of Staff. And he was hired straight from being a lobbyist for a company called Acana. Their job as a lobby group was to try and put the kibosh on the container trading scheme, which essentially is when you get a recyclable container and you return it from the place that you purchased, you get a little bit of a refund. And it's designed to encourage people to go out and recycle more. It was one of the policies that was thrown on the bonfire when Chris Hipkins took over as part of his rebranding and realignment of priorities for his Labour government. But before he was Chief of Staff and a lobbyist, Andrew Curtin was the person in charge of Jacinda Ardern's 2017 election. You see, we have no laws in this country that regulate lobbying, and that's a real concern. In an organisation that's supposed to have high trust from the voters for the politicians, to know that there's no regulation around this really intense group of people who have a lot of very focused priorities, that can be really problematic. There is also no cool down period in any of the laws in place at the moment around lobbying. So, in theory, you could go straight from being the person in charge of the Prime Minister's election campaign to somebody who lobbies Parliament to somebody who works in the next Prime Minister's office without a day's break in between. And in fact, there have actually been lobbyists like Chris Bishop from the National Party, who was a lobbyist for the Philip Morris Tobacco Company, right up until the day he was sworn into Parliament. And you can see a really clear switch in terms of policy with him, in that he lobbied against things like larger warning labels on cigarette packets and plain packages for cigarettes. The day he was sworn in, he turned around and said, "Those are actually policies that I support." And that becomes really problematic. especially when you're trying to deal with trust.
I personally don't care. Um, yes, they'll have inside information about what's going on, but yeah, I just feel that when people leave Parliament, they are going to find work that's probably in the same field to progress the same goals. Look, the reason people go into Parliament is because they want to do good. We just might disagree on what good is, but they want to do good, and they're probably going to go back into the real world and have jobs where they can continue that work, but through another platform. It might not be politics, it could be lobbying, I guess, or media, whatever it is. So I'm not sure how much of an advantage it would really have. I assume they still have to play by the same rules. If there are in fact rules about being a lobby group, maybe there's a code of conduct. And certainly, anytime you say you leave your employment as just a like Jane Doe like me or whatever, there are usually some clauses in your contract about what you can and can't do. So I'm assuming if something like that was in place, it would be fair. Because how long could you exclude people from being able to take on other roles? Yeah, it doesn't seem like a biggie to me, but certainly I think it could be an area looked at, and particularly around the work it is that they are doing and what any inside information might give an advantage. Well, maybe this is where the conflict of interest comes up again, since we're here. So,
I feel okay with that because I think how to word this. They're obviously passionate about politics and making a change, and they've found that. I'd imagine, like you look at Jacinda Ardern, did her not quite her 3 years, 3 terms, 2 terms of 3 years of being prime minister. That's a tough job. That's got to that time's got to take your toll. The travelling to Wellington, not the travelling, but away from family, that support network. Because it's not an easy job. Like stress would be through the roof. So I've got no problem with that. They feel that what they're doing get away from that stress. They may have found a focus then. Hey, I want to really work on this, and no, I don't have a problem with it. I think it's potentially a good thing. They've experienced politics, so they've got an understanding of how, that side of it works and how they can the best approach with what they're aiming to achieve.
The odd thing when I asked them about campaign outreaches and successful outreach campaigns, Kelli actually had a lot of trouble articulating one that she could think of off the top of her head. And over the years, there have been many. You could consider something like the New Zealand Bird of the Year an outreach campaign based around policy, building environmental standards, and looking after endangered species. But at the same time, you could also look at something like the Three Waters issues as a policy campaign that's been put out by lobbyists. And it does run the entire spectrum from left to right, green to yellow. It is very much every party has a campaign that they want to get out there. So when I asked Kelli for specifics, she had a little bit of trouble actually narrowing it down.
I'm sure there is. But I think because the way, and again, this is the way that I think about lobby groups. When I see what's happening with our emissions trading scheme, or I see what's happening, so for example, forestry or farming or agriculture, new lobby groups influencing those really key climate change policies. I see their influence there by them being either watered down or not even included at all. So I see that influence. I have to say, I do know from being in the community sector that what we do in the community makes a difference, but naming a campaign that we've seen be turned into government policy, I can't name one off the top of my head, but I do know there are some.
When it came to Dan, though, he had a really specific campaign in mind around what a lobby group can achieve. And that's really in his field, in his wheelhouse as an electrician. And it's around the rules that have changed for apprentices. Now, we all hear in the news about the need for more tradespeople and the need to get more apprentices through. And the Labour Party has touted having a huge amount of new apprentices having started training or entering the industry. One of the things that we might not realise as a general public, though, is that some of those rules around what an apprentice can and can't do on site has been changed a little bit. Well, I'll let Dan explain it.
Well, I am in Master Electricians, and we are lobbying the government for various things. Not very successful. Mainly, I think it's more the group themselves. There's lots of discussion and going round and round circles and discussing and lack of action, which the industry has evolved and the way things are done. It's evolved, but it's not enough. There is a big thing we have now is when I did my training, apprentices never went out to work by themselves. If they did, it was drilling some holes for a house or like a new build or running some cables. Never the state like people that are out after 12 months into their apprenticeship doing jobs by themselves. And I've actually had to change my mindset recently. I've got a guy that's actually nearly qualified, who sending out to do jobs by himself because just having time with my other stuff and things like that. But changing it so that we can legally do that. That's right there. Well, there's this thing called supervision, remote supervision. So I'm confident. I'm confident in his abilities. I can send him out, and I'll remotely supervise him. So if there's any issues, he'll call me, etc., etc. Like for example, he went and changed a bathroom fan the other day. Like it's not replacing a switchboard, the thing. So it's, but then yeah, so it's a grey area. It depends who you talk to. It depends how you interpret the rules. So it needs cleaning up to protect us all because there's a lot of apprentices being sent out doing work by themselves. Shouldn't be.
So, those particular changes to the law around apprentice electricians, those were ones that were put in place with the help of this lobby group that Dan is part of. And whether or not you think it's the right thing to do or not, it's a law change that happened because of lobbyists. One of the things I loved about this conversation with Kelli is that she was really specifically being careful about balance, in that she understands what her perception is of a lobby group or a lobbyist, and it's not necessarily a positive one. But she also understands that her idea of what needs to happen, what's good, what's right, what the best policy points are, aren't necessarily going to be the same as anybody else or of everybody else. And that they have as much right to lobby and to talk to the local politicians as Kelli does in the groups that she supports, which I found really fascinating. It's a really rare thing to find when you are dealing with politicians and politics, people who are quite happy to sit there and weigh up both sides, especially in an election year. It's a breath of fresh air, to be honest.
When I think about this, if I have to also think about the lobby groups that I consider to be good, that are usually for environmental or social topics, they can never have enough influence, right? But the ones where I think, when I think of federated farmers, they have too much. So I'm trying to reconcile what I would, how things are fair. Just because I think something is good and right doesn't mean other people do. Um, so that's kind of a tough one. I do have concerns about the amount of money behind lobby groups. So I know charities with no money, they're completely volunteer powered, do some amazing work. They don't have the backing of some of the lobby groups that can go in there, like Federated Farmers, and actually make tangible changes and hold things up, basically. So really, it's a lot around the backing that political parties and lobby groups have is where I have an issue.
Neither Kelli nor Dan knew the term astroturfing, and I was a little surprised. I thought it was a term most people knew, but apparently not. It's essentially a fake grassroots movement, and it's usually set up by a business organization, a corporate interest, somebody with a ton of money, or a political party to look like a grassroots movement, but isn't. It's there to push the narrative that they want pushed. At the last election, one of the ACT Party advertising people actually who came forward and said, you know what, we set up the taxpayers union, that's on us to discredit the Green Party. And that kind of movement, because it starts off in a disingenuous way, it doesn't always win the hearts and minds of people. Now, both of the people that we spoke to this week brought up really bad campaigns that were full of misinformation. It was quite interesting as well that they were both from astroturfing groups.
Federated Farmers been around 100 plus years. Um, they've always been that voice, always been there I wasn't saying in the background, but not in the background. They've always had that collective's back, so to say. And they've worked on things over the years and fixed things and done things, which is good. But then you get Groundswell that just, it seems to be a fanfare, song and a dance. Let's make a lot of noise. And saying we're representing the farmers, but they probably are representing some farmers, but it is a minority, I'd imagine. Like the farmers will, what they're trying to achieve, some aspects of it, the farmers will be wanting. I think everyone's wanting. The Three Waters is an interesting debate. Groundswell is just one aspect. And they're making a lot of noise about it, which it's coming across as noise. Everyone I've spoken to about it's just noise, this Groundswell crowd. And also you read their information, which is actually misinformation if you do a little bit of research, which is not hard to do, what they're saying and what the actual facts are.
I do think most of us know that there's big money behind some of those campaigns. We might not know exactly who or where it comes from, but we're super aware of it. The Three Waters campaign, for example, from being very, very misinformed, was so highly organised and came from so many different ways. It was really quite hard to track just where it came from and who was behind it, and certainly transparency would help.
The Three Waters campaign was highly organised. It had a lot of money behind it. There's actually video footage that came out from members of the Taxpayers Union with Voices for Freedom members and New Conservative members in a meeting in Selwyn in Christchurch 2 weeks ago, where they were gloating about how they had made the whole conversation around Māoridom and about their use of co-governance, which has been in action for years and was initially set up under the last government. It's that kind of misinformation that gets people really angry and really worked up that made their Three Waters campaign so memorable, and also what made it so annoying to so many people. In the same vein, the kind of campaign that Groundswell ran last year, which was a repeat of a campaign that they'd had a year before, where they basically sent tractors into the middle of main urban centres to shut everything down. That was a massive flop. You had more protesters out from Voices for Freedom than you had farmers because it was organised in the middle of a farmer's busiest period. It pissed off farmers because they were busy working, doing what they can to make a living. And the people that organised it suffered a lot of backlash because, as farmers apparently, they should have known that this was an incredibly busy time for other farmers. On top of that, it pissed off townies, it pissed off everybody involved. It was really poorly organised. That's what Dan remembers most about it.
Groundswell, for example, all their protesting and blocking up traffic, and they're not gaining favour, not so much from the politicians, but from the people they're apparently representing. Blocking traffic and things like that. Traffic's bad enough.
So this has been really interesting for me to to think around good lobbyist, bad lobbyist, and how we be fair to both. There are some that I wish disappeared, the moneyed ones usually, who are self-serving, but we have to treat them the same. So, you could say some are in public interest, but you could also argue they're all for public interest because they all lobbyists represent the views of the people that they're there for. It's a tough one. It's an interesting one, an interesting thing to think about, and the fact that the environmental groups I didn't even consider as lobby groups. But there you are. They are.
Interestingly, the people behind that particular groundswell movement, that particular protest last year, a number of them are actually running for government this year, but they are generally running under, let's just call them, alternative parties. In fact, one of them was part of Democracy NZ up until sometime during the week when they had a massive falling out. That involvement of conspiracy theorists and these sort of astroturfing groups is a little concerning. For Dan, though, there is another group that's even more concerning to have on board as a lobby group, to have the ear of our politicians. That's the religious ones.
that's just pushing a massive agenda of their way. Or I think I'm not too familiar with the Bible, but I believe it says something about basically don't be a dick, be good to your neighbours and accept them. But all these religious lobbyists do the exact opposite of what the Bible supposedly teaches.
In Aotearoa, lobby groups take a number of shapes, and they don't all look the same. They're not all astroturfing groups like the Taxpayer Union or Groundswell or the Free Speech Union. They're not all big, mysterious, conspiracy theorist pushers like Voices for Freedom. But they're also not all things like trade unions and employee unions. They're not organisations like Forests and Bird. The Exclusive Brethren could be considered a lobby group. It's a religious group that decided at the 2017 election it was going to put on a prayer vigil for Bill English and the National Party to go out and win the election, and they've been known to invest funds and have the ear of certain politicians around the table. A lobby group doesn't necessarily mean a good thing or a bad thing, the right thing or the wrong thing. They're like the point of a spear. Really the sharp part that's trying to get across a message and make change. And whether you agree with that change or not is going to be completely reliant on whatever your ideologies are. There's no right or wrong when it comes to trying to make change and make the world better. There's just different perspectives. Usually. Now, there are lobby groups out there that go out of their way to spread misinformation and disinformation. Those are incredibly dangerous ones for people to fall down the rabbit hole of believing. And they're getting a lot of traction. They are really good at getting the press coverage that makes people seem to think that they are legitimate. And it could be something as simple as having the word union in their name when they're not a union. These groups have a lot of influence. Our biggest problem, though, should be the fact that it's not a regulated industry. There is no laws regulating who can lobby, when they can lobby, how they go about lobbying, and which politicians interact with them. There's nothing in place that says specifically what it is that they're doing, who it is that they're approaching, and how our politicians are reacting to this. That's really the big area around lobbying that we need to fix, that we need to improve on. That's it for this episode. Thank you very much for listening. I will catch you all next time.